Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into
Yeah.
Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness,
Okay.
a real cornerstone of existentialist thought.
Right.
I know
Wow.
these dense philosophical works can be
Right.
a little daunting,
Yeah.
but don't worry,
Uh,
we're going to unpack all those ideas and try to make them accessible to everybody.
Being and Nothingness is just an incredible work. Sartre constructs just this really unique framework for understanding consciousness and
Yeah.
existence
Yeah.
and our interactions with the world. He digs into these profound questions about the nature of being, freedom, responsibility, and how our relationships with other people work.
Yeah, so to give everyone a bit of a roadmap, Sartre's work really revolves around a
Yes.
few core themes.
Okay.
He distinguishes between two types of being in itself, which refers to the material world, and being for itself, which describes consciousness.
Mm.
And this distinction kind of sets the stage for his whole exploration
Right.
of nothingness
Yeah.
and its role in shaping our existence.
Exactly. And Sartre's concept of nothingness, it isn't just like the absence of things, it's a fundamental aspect of consciousness itself. He argues that our awareness is characterized by like a lack, a not being, that allows us to question, imagine, and perceive absence.
Yeah, he famously uses that example of Pierre's absence in a cafe to kind of illustrate this point.
Yeah.
You're looking for Pierre, but he's not there. So the cafe itself becomes the backdrop against which Pierre's absence, that nothingness, becomes apparent.
Yeah, that absence, that nothingness, that's what gives us freedom. You see, because we aren't complete or fixed beings, we have the capacity to choose, to imagine different possibilities, and to act upon the world. This freedom, though, it comes with a heavy burden, responsibility.
And that's where his famous quote comes in. Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. And he argues that we are responsible for creating meaning
Yeah.
in a world that is inherently meaningless. And this can lead to anguish. The feeling of being burdened by the weight of our choices.
But it's important to remember that Sartre isn't advocating for nihilism or despair or anything like that. He's highlighting the responsibility that comes with our existence. We are the authors of our own lives.
So if nothingness is so fundamental to consciousness, how does it actually shape our experience of the world and of ourselves?
Well, Sartre argues that nothingness allows us to transcend the immediate, to project ourselves into the future and imagine possibilities. Think about it. If you were completely defined by the present moment, if your being was fixed and complete, you wouldn't be able to conceive of anything different.
That makes me think of his concept of bad faith. That's where we try to deny our freedom and responsibility. Pretend that we're just objects determined by external forces, like the waiter who
Right.
plays at being a waiter,
Yeah.
losing sight of his own ability to choose.
Exactly. Bad faith is a way of trying to escape the anguish of freedom. But ultimately, it's just a futile attempt. We're always making choices, even when we try to convince ourselves otherwise. Denying our freedom is in itself a choice.
Then he goes on to explore temporality. Our experience of time is another key aspect of consciousness. He argues that we exist in three ecstasies of time: the past, the present, and the future.
And this is where his view of time gets really interesting. He challenges that traditional linear view of time. The past isn't simply gone. It shapes who we are in the present. The future isn't predetermined. It's a realm of possibilities that we're constantly projecting ourselves towards.
So for Sartre, our being is this constant process of becoming, integrating our past, making choices in the present, and projecting ourselves into a future we're actively creating. It's a dynamic and fluid process.
Now, how does this all connect back to you, listener? Think about the choices you make every day, the plans you create for the future, the ways you define yourself. Are you truly owning your freedom and responsibility? Or are you slipping into bad faith, trying to avoid the weight of your choices?
It's challenging, but ultimately it's empowering, wouldn't you say? We're not simply passive passengers on this journey of life, but active participants, shaping our own paths and creating meaning in a world that doesn't inherently have it.
Exactly. And this understanding of being, nothingness, freedom, and responsibility. This sets the stage for Sartre's exploration of one of the most complex and fascinating aspects of the human experience, our relationships with others.
And that's where things get really interesting. So stay tuned as we dive into Sartre's analysis of the other and the profound impact they have on our sense of self.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Sartre's Being and Nothingness. As we explored in part 1, Sartre argues that nothingness is fundamental to our consciousness, giving us both freedom and the weighty responsibility. of creating meaning in a world that's inherently meaningless.
And now we're delving into how this understanding of being and nothingness plays out in our relationships with others, which Sartre explores through this concept of the other.
Yeah, the other for Sartre represents any consciousness that is not our own. It's that realization that we are not alone in the world, that other beings exist with their own thoughts and feelings and perspectives.
But here's the catch. We can never truly know the other. As a subject, as a being with their own internal world, we're always trapped within our own consciousness, experiencing the other as an object through our own perceptions and interpretations.
Yeah, this fundamental inability to fully know the other creates a constant tension in our relationships. On the one hand, we desire connection, to be loved and understood by the other. But on the other hand, we fear being objectified, reduced to the other's perception of us.
So it's like a constant push and pull between wanting to be close to someone, but also wanting to maintain our own sense of self.
Exactly. And to navigate this tension, Sartre says, we adopt different attitudes towards the other. Love, desire, indifference, even sadism. These are all ways of trying to relate to the other and manage this fundamental tension.
So let's break down some of these attitudes. What does Sartre mean by desire, for example?
Desire for Sartre is about trying to possess the other, to overcome their otherness and make them a part of ourselves. It's an attempt to bridge that gap between our consciousness and theirs, to know them fully and completely.
But as we discussed, that's ultimately impossible. We can't truly possess another person's freedom.
And that leads to frustration, a sense of incompleteness that can drive us to try even harder to control the other in its extreme form. This desire for control can manifest as sadism,
which Sartre describes as a way of objectifying the other even further, asserting our freedom at the expense of theirs. It's a desperate attempt to escape the anxiety and ambiguity of genuine relationships by exerting power over the other.
No, one of the most crucial aspects of how we experience the other is through what Sartre calls the look, which we touched on a little bit earlier. Can you imagine that feeling, listener, of suddenly becoming self-aware when you realize someone is staring at you? That's Sartre's look in action, and it reveals just how deeply connected we are to the perceptions of others.
It's like a sudden shift in awareness. You're not just a subject experiencing the world. You become an object being experienced by someone else. It can be incredibly unsettling.
That feeling of being objectified, reduced to a thing in the eyes of another. That's where shame arises for Sartre. It's the painful awareness of our own vulnerability, of being exposed and potentially judged. What's interesting is that shame usually comes from something we've done, but Sartre is saying it can also arise from simply being seen, from that realization that we are always potentially an object for others.
This kind of raises the question, how much of our self-awareness is actually shaped by the way others see us? Do we only become self-conscious when we realize we're being perceived as objects?
It's a mind-bending concept, and it highlights this really complex interplay between our own sense of self and how we're perceived by others.
So where does all of this leave us in terms of authentic relationships? We're always kind of struggling with the other, caught in this interplay of freedom and objectification. Is there any hope for genuine connection?
Well, Sartre acknowledges the inherent difficulty and conflict that come with relationships. He doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does suggest that authentic relationships, while rare, involve a kind of mutual recognition.
A willingness to respect the other as a subject. Rather than just an object, acknowledging their freedom and complexity.
Precisely. It's a challenging ideal, but it points toward a more ethical way of relating to others, one that moves beyond simply trying to possess or control them. And this leads us to another key aspect of Sartre's philosophy, his exploration of doing and having.
So stay with us as we unpack those concepts and see how they connect back to these themes of being, nothingness, and the other. We'll discover how doing and having relate to our fundamental desire for being and how they shape our engagement with the world and the search for meaning in our lives. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into being and nothingness. We've covered a lot of ground, exploring Sartre's ideas about being and nothingness, freedom and responsibility, the complexities of our relationships with others. Now we're going to tackle what might seem like a bit of a shift in gears, Sartre's views on doing and having.
Okay.
But trust me, these concepts are intricately connected to everything we've talked about so far.
Absolutely. Sartre's analysis of doing and having goes straight to the heart of what it means to exist as a human being in a world without inherent meaning. Remember, he keeps emphasizing that we're not fixed entities, but are constantly in a state of becoming. Well, doing and having are really key to understanding how that process unfolds.
Okay, so let's start with doing. What exactly does Sartre mean by that? And how does it relate to his ideas about freedom and responsibility?
Well, for Sartre, doing is all about action, engagement with the world. It's the way we express our freedom, how we project ourselves into the future and shape our reality. It's not just about any kind of action, though. It's about actions that are chosen, actions that stem from our free will, not reflexes or unconscious habits, but deliberate choices that we make.
So doing is about taking responsibility for our existence in a world that doesn't offer any predetermined meaning. We create meaning through our actions, through our engagement with the world.
Exactly. But Sartre also points out that our doing is always situated. It's constrained by our facticity, by the circumstances we're born into, the limitations of our bodies, the choices that other people make. So it's not as if we have this unlimited power to just do whatever we want. Our freedom is always negotiated within a specific context.
Now, how does having fit into all this? Is it the opposite of doing?
Not quite. Sartre sees having as another way. We try to engage with the world, but it's a more static, possessive way. It's about trying to grasp, to hold on to things, to make them a part of ourselves. Think about that feeling, listener. When you just crave that new phone, you think it's going to make you be someone better, someone more complete. But Sartre would say, true fulfillment comes from doing, not having.
That makes me think of that example he uses of trying to possess a slimy object. You reach out to grab it, but it just slips through your fingers. It seems like he's highlighting this inherent frustration that comes with trying to possess things.
Exactly. It emphasizes this impossibility of truly possessing anything. Because ultimately, even the things we own, they're still external to us. They can be taken away, they can break, they can lose their value. So having is this kind of illusion, this attempt to find security and completeness in external things. And it's always doomed to fail. True fulfillment for Sartre can't be found in possessions. It comes from doing, from embracing our freedom and creating meaning through our actions.
But here's where it gets really tricky. Sartre argues that even our desire to have things stems from this deeper desire to be. We try to acquire things because we think they'll make us more complete, more secure in our being.
What's so fascinating about Sartre is how he connects these everyday desires to this fundamental existential drive. He's saying that behind our craving for that new car or that bigger house is this deeper longing for a sense of being, a sense of wholeness that we can never quite grasp.
And this longing, this desire to be, it's ultimately directed towards God, right?
Well, that's where Sartre gets really provocative. He argues that the ultimate object of our desire is to become godlike, to possess that kind of self-sufficiency and completeness that we imagine God has. But of course, that's impossible. We're finite beings thrown into a world defined by nothingness and contingency.
So we're left with this kind of tragic paradox. We have this infinite desire to be, but we're forever limited by our finite nature.
Which brings us right back to Sartre's emphasis on freedom and responsibility. Even though we can't become God, we are responsible for creating our own meaning. Doing is how we do that. It's how we express our freedom, engage with the world, and create a sense of meaning in the face of the absurd.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into being and nothingness,
Yeah.
what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, Sartre challenges us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the human condition, that we're fundamentally free, which means we're also radically responsible, that the world doesn't offer any predetermined meaning, which can be both liberating and terrifying, and that our relationships with others are complex and often fraught with tension. He encourages us to embrace our freedom, take responsibility for our choices, and find meaning in the midst of the absurd.
It's certainly not a feel-good philosophy, but there's a refreshing honesty to it, a willingness to really grapple with these big questions. And even though Sartre doesn't offer any easy answers, he gives us a powerful framework for understanding ourselves and the world in a more authentic way.
Perhaps most importantly, he reminds us to recognize the freedom and complexity of others, even if we can never fully grasp them.
So, listener, as we leave you to ponder the depths of being and nothingness, we'll leave you with this thought. If, as Sartre suggests, we are condemned to be free, what choices will you make? How will you shape your own existence in this world that's full of both possibility and nothingness? Thanks for joining us on this philosophical journey. Until next time,